I think we can all agree that change is a terrifying force to be reckoned with. Whether it's a sudden shift in the status quo, a loss of innocence, or an inevitable tragedy, change can be very scary, especially when it involves our loved ones. I know many have that core memory where they realize their parents aren't perfect, or their childhood best friend is drifting apart. Perhaps a loved one's life gets cut short, or the thought of losing them leads to severe anxiety. No matter the case, change can spark patterns of emotional suppression and destructive behavior, but it doesn't have to be this way. Just because change happens and it's difficult to accept doesn't mean we have to let the thought of it anchor us down. I've been told these lessons many times growing up and went through my own share of scary, life-changing events. However, I never fully understood that in order to welcome change, I had to take the initiative myself to make the best of opportunities, evaluate my relationships, and talk things out if I needed to. That was until my later years of college, when amidst some difficult experiences, I stumbled across this lesser-known indie horror game with the budget of a greeting card and the passion of 1,000 suns. It was called Echo. In the early 2010s, there was an obscure erotic horror novel in development called Blackgate. It was relatively well liked by its niche at the time, and its creator, Bane, got a little too ambitious. Later in March 2015, he announced an upcoming spin-off premise that he dubbed Project C. This was an opportunity for aspiring writers to submit their own story ideas, and whichever Bane liked the most would become a greenlit project with the original writer in charge. Out of the 6 ideas on the short list, one stood out above the rest due to its relatively small-scale premise about a homecoming in a small desert town. Written by a complete unknown under the alias Howley, Echo was well received by subscribers and got smacked with Bane's seal of approval. What happened to Blackgate is a rabbit hole of its own, but Echo proved it was far more substantial. It cut its spin-off ties, shaped its own brand, and shocking to many furries at the time, actually made progress in its development.
We are... That's what I thought.
Inspired by the works of Stephen King, H.P. Lovecraft, Paul G. Tremblay, and Kiel Gold, Echo was based on the real-life ghost town of the same name in Utah. The project regularly updated throughout the mid to late 2010s with concept art, early sprite iterations, beta releases, Patreon-exclusive side stories, and even new characters added as crowdfunding rewards, building up a small but very devoted following that only got bigger as time went by. Unfortunately, development was not a smooth sail. Most devs were still in college when it started, many files were lost or scrapped throughout the process, and earlier builds had what its second author described as a seat-of-your-pants writing approach. Howley especially was very vocal about his crippling mental health across numerous Patreon updates, and eventually he dropped out entirely to work on other stories. Against all odds though, Echo reached a complete state and released for free on itch.io on April 2nd, 2021. It's honestly impressive that this game even finished, which makes its rather questionable legacy sting a bit in retrospect. Don't get me wrong, it has tons of raving reviews on its itch.io page, it inspired many independent creators to write their own visual novels, and you'll still see a ton of fan art if you search online. It even got dropped out of nowhere on a Pyrocynical stream.
What is VN Echo? Okay. What the f is that? What?
However, I can't deny from personal experience that the more time has gone by, the more its public reception has soured. I've seen many take dunks on this story and say that it's aged about as well as milk. I've seen many argue it's pretentious, it's amateurly written, it rushes through and underutilizes its concepts, its characters are too unlikable or underwritten. Especially these 4. As for me though, I've always been fascinated by Echo. This game is a mess. It's held together by popsicle sticks and duct tape, it doesn't take full advantage of its medium, and its overarching story is held back by clumsy plots and half-baked execution. For all its shortcomings though, I can't deny I left a huge stain on my mind in ways that not a lot of stories do. No matter how many times I move on to other things and try to forget about it, something about Echo just comes back to haunt me, so it must be doing something right. Now that this novel is 4 years old, I figured there's no better time to revisit it and offer my perspective on what it's trying to say and if it's still worth checking out. Love it or hate it, Echo stands the test of time as an experience that I'll never forget. Set in Arizona during the spring break of 2015, that's a full decade ago, Lord have mercy, you take the wheel as Chase, a college student revisiting his hometown for a school project. He and his old childhood friends take it as an opportunity to reunite after going separate ways for the past 3 years. Things seem mostly pleasant as the group takes their day off to reconnect, but there's a subtle aura of discomfort present that slowly becomes harder to ignore. Nostalgia is a double-edged sword, as they say, and the group's hometown is not a place to fondly reminisce. Echo itself is a rundown ghost town with barely a population, most of which is shady at best, and a long history of traumatic events. These aren't just bizarre cases of mass hysteria from the past though. Everyone, especially Chase and his friends, have gone through some kind of traumatic experience that the town reminds them of. This is most apparent when the group revisits Lake Emma, where an old friend of theirs named Sydney mysteriously drowned. To put it mildly, this causes Flynn to lose his mind and berate everyone in the group, including Chase. From this point on, Echo becomes an anthology of 5 different short stories, each of which follow a similar structure with one of Chase's friends being put in the spotlight. Whether they're the deuteragonist or the antagonist, Chase and the reader are forced to confront their worst aspects. This town's residents have gotten into very deep water, and the more they dwell here, the more their fears seem to escalate. While Echo doesn't have the most unique premise, its uncanny similarity to other games is very intentional. It creates an inviting sense of déjà vu to lure readers in and establish this friend group as the novel's emotional core. Enough is shown about the cast to believe their history of connection, but it's also made apparent they've got some unresolved conflict brewing, building up tension that culminates at the lake. All these elements come together to introduce Echo as a cynical deconstruction of the niche that inspired its creation, especially the few novels there were for furries at the time. It presents this argument that embracing wish fulfillment and self-indulgence, whether in a small homecoming or more broadly adult visual novels in general, only brings short-term pleasure and slowly fuels more harmful desires. Chase and all the main characters in this story reflect this in some way. Leo has an unhealthy fixation with Chase becomes obsessed with TJ in one route, Flynn has a hard time letting go of Sydney, and for a brief moment, the reader themselves is called out for their potential obsession with getting in their friend's pants. Such a bold thesis is also conveyed by Echo's choice of structure. Throughout the medium's history, from canon all the way to Katawa Shoujo, romantic visual novels tend to share a similar narrative structure. The protagonist goes through a day-by-day rising action with a few branches adjacent to different characters, narrowing down the scope to one of many paths with their own climax and resolution. This results in a collection of standalone but thematically incomplete short stories that come together to tell a complete overarching narrative, taking advantage of time and player agency in ways a standard novel can't. Echo isn't much different. Everyone is framed as a love interest for Chase in their own respective routes, building up tension between them until all hell breaks loose. Instead of being a romance story though, Echo is a horror story where romance and friendship go hand in hand, making the stakes feel personal and ending in some kind of tragedy. It's an interesting concept that has a lot of elements working in its favor, but as I've grown older and looked back, the more cracks I've noticed in this novel's premise and general narrative. On a positive note, I'd say the beginning of Echo right before the route division is very solid. Maybe it could have been a little longer, but it introduces the cast very nicely and wastes no time building up tension. When the falling out happens, it's easy to feel the emotional weight, and none of that tension fizzles once Chase has to make his decision. The prologue hammers in the point that sometimes people grow up and leave their friends behind for a reason. But what could that reason be? If there's one friend to spend the week with and find out, who would Chase decide? That's the question Echo prompts the reader with the route division that follows, and it makes for a compelling hook. Without a doubt though, Echo's strongest element has to be its approach to mystery. There are many, and I mean many secrets to discover about the town, the residents, the cases of hysteria, and the friend group's own dysfunction. This novel takes advantage of its branching structure to only offer bits and pieces of the full mystery at a time. Exposition comes very naturally through drama and debate between the characters, and even subtle details like their facial expressions or something in the background. Since every route provides answers to some questions while prompting others, reading this novel evokes excitement as the pieces of the puzzle come together. And even though Chase knows some of what happened in the past, the fact that he too keeps secrets from the reader means there's always more to look out for. However, that's where most of my praises with this novel's general premise and setup come to an end. When viewing Echo as a deconstruction, or an anti-dating sim as I've seen people call it, it's honestly pretty shallow. Sure, a few scenes do have blueprints for dissecting the genre's conventions, such as this moment where Chase is framed as the root cause for the town's hysteria, or this scene mentioned earlier where Flynn breaks the fourth wall to tell the reader that trying to get in his pants after years of absence is kind of a dick move. These feel like a middle finger to Mornatsu in particular, which Halley himself had cited as another source of inspiration. It calls out the niche's tendency to warp the logic of its setting and have its rather boring protagonist be the center of attention. However, scenes like these are far too rare in Echo. It otherwise follows this conventional visual novel structure so closely to a T, it essentially becomes a part of what it's dissecting, even down to moments of intimacy that feel ripped from any generic erotica. They may serve a greater narrative purpose to reveal more insight on these characters and their messy relationships, but their generally voyeuristic nature makes them hard to distinguish from wish fulfillment. Another key issue is the fact that, while the stories follow a slow burn pace you'd associate with visual novels like Steins Gate or Clannad, the medium itself feels largely taken for granted. The conventions it does use are either undercooked or come across as awkward band-aid solutions to pass off as deconstruction. Chase's isolation with each friend happens far too early in the week, and every route is so linear with such few dialogue options that have any significance or meaningful flavor text. It's basically a standard anthology of books. Even this early option for the player to decide Chase's sexuality only affects bits and pieces of one of the 5 main routes, and nothing more beyond the character's dynamic. The general plot is otherwise the same. For some reason, only 3 of the 5 routes have alternate endings, which are triggered by 1 or 2 dialogue choices at most. And spoiler alert, they all pretty much suck. They're supposed to be bad endings, sure, but as thematic antitheses to their respective routes, they fall flat on their face and feel like an afterthought. Worst of all though, sometimes reading Echo past the route division feels like reading different chapters in a book that got chopped up and tossed around like a salad, which at best makes the storytelling feel clumsy, and at worst completely dampers the overarching narrative. Without mentioning direct spoilers, the first route I read reveals a very important detail about the culprit behind a very important plot catalyst. What was blatantly spelled out to the reader in less than a few minutes in one route was the same revelation a different route spent hours leading up to. This breaks so much tension and hurts the payoff it needed to justify its length in this route, which wouldn't have been so egregious if the subplot leading up to it was engaging, but it just kept going and going. However, I don't think any example is more damning than Leo's characterization. So much tension in his route came from the gradual unveiling of his fractured headspace and obsessions. But all that slow buildup amounts to nothing when other routes immediately bring out his worst qualities. It's hard to go back to his route and invest in the more personal or sensual scenes with him when the reader already knows he's a wolf in sheepskin. I think these issues could have been avoided if Echo was structured more like Umineko, where its linearity preserves the twists and turns for their appropriate reveal and the story stays engaging all throughout. As it is though, Echo sets itself up as an antithesis to the genre's familiar conventions, only to trip over its own feet in most instances. It doesn't commit to the strengths of a visual novel, meaning all that's left is a substantially nerfed anthology, where the medium's shortcomings are far more apparent. It does provide a solid introduction and a sense of player agency to give its story a strong setup, but at the cost of its payoff. Perhaps I'm being too harsh though. Just because this novel has problems with its structure and fumbles its premise in some areas, doesn't mean it's broken at its core. It's an anthology of 5 different routes with their own unique story, main characters, and themes, so it's only fair to examine each on their own merit. I'll be going through the novel's routes by order of completion, offer my analysis, and evaluate just how well they've stood the test of time, both as a standalone story and as a part of Echo. If you are concerned about spoilers, read it. Being the first story complete in the novel's development, it's no surprise that Carl's route is fairly straightforward. Ever since the goat dropped out of college and fell behind Chase, he's spent the last few years suffering from anxiety and depression, smoking pot and having do-nothing days in his big fancy mansion. He makes it clear to Chase that he has no idea of how to live a normal life without feeling completely useless, and he has a tendency to over-rely on others for basic needs. Essentially, Carl's route is a story about how personal growth and self-care require self-acceptance. Trusting others and forming meaningful connections helps a ton, but over-relying on others for fixing your own problems and robbing your agency is where the line must be drawn. Getting out of a slump is not easy, especially when that requires breaking old habits. But taking initiative to recognize where you're going wrong and act upon it is a great first step. The first act is not bad at all. While mysteries of the town and Carl's ancestor are gradually set up, Carl himself is a real highlight. He's easy to empathize with, he has fun chemistry with Chase, and the story does a good job at naturally showing his clear dependence on others. I love the sequence of events on Saturday where Chase helps Carl get ready for a job interview, but it backfires horribly and leads to a panic attack. There's great visual storytelling here that shows how even the most difficult things in life, like getting ready for a job interview, are difficult for him. How he can't seem to take action without validation from his friends. He didn't want to do this job interview, but he couldn't say no either. We understand that he wants to do better and find a place in the world, but he doesn't know how, partially because he lacks the motivation, but also because he fears there is no place for him and his friends can't even be trusted. It's a simple but compelling enough story, but once he, Chase, and for some reason Jenna get whisked away into this creepy ghost dimension in the second act, the route starts to suck. Ignoring how much it can bend your suspension of disbelief, it's not a broken concept by any means. This mansion is a reminder of Carl's over-tendency to mooch off others, his inability to leave his parents' house and get his life together. Being stuck here creates a strong sense of inescapable dread that's reflective of his isolation and anxiety. I can also buy into this subplot where Carl gets easily possessed by the ghost of his ancestor. It's a little on the nose, but considering how much of the first act showed his clear desperation, this takes it up a notch in a way that feels natural and adds a bit of conflict. Unfortunately, these elements feel greatly undermined by countless mansion shenanigans that feel straight out of Goosebumps. These scenes drag on for far too long, involve a game of cat and mouse between the ghosts of Carl and Jenna's ancestors that's very hard to care about, and worst of all, they're not scary. They're boring, and not fun to read.
I just can't do it. I can't take this shit no more, man.
Mildly unnerving at points, sure, such as this eerie scene with Carl, and some unexpected moments where Jenna tries to shank a bitch under her ancestors' control. But otherwise, the route just becomes a chore to read. This wouldn't all be so damning if the story had excellent payoff to thematically tie this sequence of events to the first act. But sadly, it's a bit too underwhelming. If Chase tells Carl not to let James control him anymore, he later has an emotional epiphany, rejecting the ghost and accepting that he doesn't need to be important or live up to others' expectations to live his life. He recognizes the severity of his dependency on others, even telling Chase to back it off, and decides to give life another chance on his own terms. On its own, it's a pretty nice scene, and I can see it resonating with anyone who's gone through the same struggles, but it lacks staying power since A, so much focus got steered away by all the ghost shenanigans, and B, the one connection this ghost subplot had to Carl's struggles was completely soiled by how awful James was. Not just as an antagonist, but just as a character. He's not just the founding father of the town who played a key role in the town's original mass hysteria case. Oh no, no, no. He's also a sodomist, and a pedophile, and a serial killer, and the owner of a private sex dungeon where he'd kidnap, torture, rape, and murder a bunch of Native American children. I just can't take this seriously anymore. He feels ripped from a bad creepypasta that tries way too hard to make its villain evil. Knowing this, the weight of Carl's decision and any good reason this ghost subplot exists get thrown out the window. It's basic common sense not to let a pedophilic murder freak linger in your mind, Carl. This just baffles me the longer I think about it because I can tell this route has blueprints for a story akin to Night in the Woods. The main character spends time hanging out with friends and later faces dangerous situations that lead to a life-changing realization. Night in the Woods worked though because everything May did was directly tied to the story's themes of seeing value in life and being there for the people around her, despite how much trauma and mental illness led her to think otherwise. Even if a lot of activities seemed mundane at first, the story kept its focus on the people and the personal conflicts that mattered. This cartoonishly evil murder freak and his twink of a ghost did not. To give the story credit though, I did get a bit emotional from this route's epilogue. Seeing Carl return to uni with Chase, majoring in something he's passionate about this time, shows a lot of growth and agency that his old friend respects. He's no longer just saying that he'll take initiative to do better, he's showing it. It's a satisfying ending for sure, but it sadly doesn't make up for how much of a slog this route could be. As the first route in Echo, it could have been a lot worse, but to say it had squandered potential would be an understatement, and it's not a great way to start off the entire novel. I'm sorry, Carl. You might be a nice goat, but you were not given the chance to be the goat. When I first read this novel and the credits rolled in this route, I knew there was something special about it.
It's very good.
From this point on, every short story felt like it better utilized the novel's emotional core, with more engaging plots, more heated tensions, and more effective horror. Leo's route has its own share of issues, and it certainly juggles a lot, starting off as essential romance before devolving into a creature-infested slasher. However, these elements go hand in hand to say something profound about relationships, self-reflection, and growing up. Case in point, Leo himself is one of the novel's most important characters. Every route involves him in some way or form, and for better or worse, he's played a huge role in keeping his friends together. He arranged the whole get-together from the beginning, and while everyone else has jaded views of the town aside from a few warm memories, Leo seems to fully embrace it. He gets upset at the notion that Echo and the group's friendship were, in his words, some kind of horrible tragedy, and wants to preserve that special magic they had growing up together. For a visual novel that largely undermined its deconstructive thesis, Leo's character is a surprising exception. He's a direct antithesis to this kimono archetype he represents. His design is visual eye candy for his specific niche, He's a childhood best friend with a seemingly caring demeanor, and he's got so much thirst for chase it could flood the Sahara. He fits the criteria of this ideal gay furry boyfriend to a T, but his love for the man of his dreams is presented as an issue rather than a charming quality. He browses porn that's disturbingly specific to resemble Chase, gaslights him to stay at a town he clearly hates, takes the reunion as an opportunity to reel him in, downplays the serious trauma that's affected them all, and by the time a mass hysteria breaks out, he completely goes off the deep end. Being a symbol of nostalgia itself, Leo illustrates the major downsides of loving someone from the past, and how it can devolve into a destructive parasocial relationship. Anyone who's ever had a toxic partner or an unhealthy fictional crush can relate to this, but I'd argue it's more of a personal call-out to the novel's target audience. It's no secret that furry communities are often mocked or stereotyped for their strong infatuation and their generally open nature regarding their particular interests. Like any community, it's harmless most of the time, but there are more than enough cases where this blatant self-indulgence gets fueled to a dangerous extent, leading to toxic relationships, patterns of selfish and unethical behavior that's concerning at best, borderline abusive, or predatory at worst. Leo was written with furries in mind because he's not only designed to quickly fawn over, but his whole obsession with the past, and particularly Chase, leads to an unhealthy fixation. He's not only a creepy and manipulative stalker, but he's completely blind to Chase's own red flags, like his constant ghosting, his general lack of accountability. More importantly though, the otter Leo is infatuated with isn't even real. What he really craves is this ideal version of Chase he remembered from the past. The one who didn't sport a goatee, wasn't afraid to get raunchy, and gave him hugs after losing a high school football game. It's no surprise this manifests as a tulpa in the story, a rose-tinted reflection of that special magic he referred to in the beginning. So the fact that Leo lures the readers in through a very idealistic romance before revealing the dark side of his obsession makes for a strong source of personal reflection. There's nothing wrong with having interests in a figment of the past or a crush you knew, but don't let it fully consume you and cloud your better judgment. What also makes Leo fascinating is the fact that, despite how deplorable he becomes, his motivations tie to a deeper anxiety that's strangely grounded in reality. He's deeply afraid of change in his life, whether it's his close friends drifting apart, or growing up to face the messiness of adulthood after an already messy childhood. It's why he feels trapped, why he shares conservative views, and why he treats his friends like a big happy family that needs to stick together and sing Kumbaya. His worldview is well-meaning, but ultimately hurtful since it creates this false sense of security, undermining bigger elephants in the room. His other friends make it clear that his romance with Chase was very problematic and stirred their pot of dysfunction, and his goal to preserve the special magic of youth by reuniting with Chase is too focused on what he wants rather than what he needs. What's a better character to represent this issue than Chase's main love interest? No one is safe from greed and insecurity, not even your loved ones. Leo's route is pretty solid for much of the time. I love how Chase and Leo's interactions gradually shine more light on their red flags throughout, without directly painting Leo as a villain off the bat. To make things better, once Chase gets kidnapped by a serial killer named Brian and the plot becomes a slasher, these horror elements thematically enrich the story in ways it wouldn't feel the same without. Brian isn't a super compelling villain, and his goofy sprites don't help, but he's written well enough that he serves his purpose as a threat. He's not only based on the real-life toy box killer in New Mexico, which makes all his scenes disturbing to read, but the way I interpret it, he's meant to be a chilling parallel to Leo, representing the monster he might eventually become if he doesn't learn to break his obsession. He was another gay man who grew up in an unwelcome environment, shared a teen romance that ended in tragedy, and was psychologically tortured by the supernatural. As heinous as Leo's actions are, he was only plagued by the embrace of Echo for about 4 years. Not his entire life, to the point where drugs, sex, and sadistic torture are the only ways he can heal or feel a sense of joy. Brian's not here to undermine any of Leo's actions by comparison, but he highlights the depths of insanity and villainy that dwelling in this town and dwelling in the past can lead to. Duke is also a decent threat with an understandable motivation. He pins down Chase and suspects him to be the cause of this surrounding mass hysteria, which feels like a natural plot relevation since Leo's tulpa lurks about. There's great irony here because, for as wrong as Duke is to hold an innocent man at gunpoint, he's not entirely wrong with his assumption. As each route progresses, it's made clear that a cosmic force in the town feeds off the suffering and trauma of its residents, elevating their fears and their most violent tendencies through hallucinations, ghosts, and other strange entities that lurk about. Fitting in line with past cases of hysteria, Chase is the spark that ignited the fire, since everyone in the town now shared a collective interest of some kind, even if it was minor. As I said before, this is a clever subversion of this logic prevalent in not just novels like Morinatsu, but most games I've played involving romance in general, which in turn highlights the general superficiality of Chase and Leo's rather self-indulgent and one-sided relationship. There are genuinely brilliant instances in Leo's route, where the novel smartly subverts tropes to say something meaningful about relationships, clinging to the past, and growing up. As an overall story, though, I can't say that it fully stuck the landing due to 3 key issues. Issue A, Kudzu. I get the need for there to be a voice of reason in the story, but I am not a fan of how much screen time this character eats up. At best, he's too much of an archetype that lacks any compelling traits, flaws, or meaningful connections to the cast. At worst, he's such a laundry list of perfection that his presence kills so much room for the readers to piece together the truth about Leo. He's also involved in many scenes that move the plot along, which robs a lot of agency from Chase and his friends, undermining the importance of this novel's emotional core. I am aware that he and other characters were added by Patreon subscribers, which is a nice way to reward the fanbase, but I wish he wasn't written like a self-insert in a Chase x Yinin fanfic. Issue B. So many scenes in this route do not flow well together and tend to happen for the dumbest of conveniences. For example, in this scene, it's revealed that all of Chase's friends are texting Leo, demanding answers as to why Chase hasn't shown up around them. Why don't they think to just call Chase on his phone then? He's used it many times before, and the phone service isn't dead yet at this point in the story. So what's stopping them? When Chase, Leo, and Kudzu flee the basement where the otter was held hostage, why did they decide to bring the kidnapper and potential killer along? That's a disaster waiting to happen, and who could have guessed? He steals Chase's car keys when no one was there to look, and steals his car, ruining their chance to escape. Great! When they do eventually find Carl and TJ and try to escape with his van, why did they decide to leave right there when the whole group is not together? Do Jenna and Flynn not mean anything to these guys? This entire scene feels contrived just so they can have a reason to get yeeted in the lake by a monster and head back to Leo's house. At night, during a mass hysteria where people are shooting each other. Okay. When Chase needs to take a leak in Kudzu's trailer, but Jenna's already in the bathroom, why doesn't he just pee in the sink if it's urgent? Contrivance! It's so he could be a complete moron, go outside, and get kidnapped by Brian again, who also just so happened to be there. You see what I meant in the title when I say this novel's kind of a mess? Issue C. The final dialogue choice feels way too hollow for a moment that's supposed to have a ton of emotional weight. I'm not against visual novels with minuscule player agency and more linearity, but there was a lot of missed opportunity for this grand climactic moment where Chase decides enough is enough. I think if Leo prompted a lot more dialogue options from Chase throughout the route, that all came together for Chase to either completely give into what Leo desires, or show that he really meant it when he said that it's over, it would have had much stronger payoff. As it is, though, it's a revelation that just sort of happens amidst the tense scene. Either that or the bad ending happens, and thanks, I hate it. This ending sucks. The urban legend it calls back to on Thursday lacks any relevance to the story's themes to justify its parallel to Chase's death, and it hinges entirely on cheap shock value with its imagery and Leo's sudden yandere portrayal. This isn't a scary antithesis to the route, it's just edgy meme fuel.
Why? Why? Why, oh god fucking why?
With all that being said, if the correct dialogue option is chosen and the good ending starts, the quality picks up tremendously. I've heard many online express disappointment or complain that Leo's route doesn't have a good ending, but honestly, I fail to see how this isn't one. Despite all the years of unhealthy fixation with the life he could only have in fantasy, Leo takes this brief moment in time to do something completely unexpected, but very impactful. He recognizes he needs to drop the anchor that his bracelet symbolized, focus less on the past, and embrace change, so both he and Chase can potentially better themselves. I'm sure everyone at some point has dealt with a toxic friend or relative that's hard to let go of, so this ending is a bittersweet reminder that sometimes the best way you can love someone difficult is to put your own selfish wants aside. It's a very poignant way to tie up this whole story about obsession and ultimately coming of age. And the fact that it's Leo, not Chase, not Kudzu, Leo, who puts his foot down to address this after everything he's done, could not have made this ending any less perfect. Like I said before, this route may be flawed, but I'd say there's enough decent use of its premise, and an ending as profound as this, to make it a substantial read. Echo as an anthology would not be the same without this route, and I can't help but respect it for the bold steps it took. Let's hope things go up from here. On the surface, TJ's route isn't too different from the rest. Most of the week is another slow burn slice of life, with similar patterns of strange encounters, and a grim third act. However, rather than devolving into a slasher towards the end, this route is more of a ghost story, with light shined on the aftermath of Sydney's death and how it affected Chase. His vocal hatred for the town comes to full fruition, revealing that beneath his cold exterior is a dangerous fear of comeuppance for something heinous he committed years ago. The more he hangs out with TJ, the more this action comes back to haunt him, driving him to insanity. Essentially, TJ's route is a different side of the same coin that Leo's represented. A similar message of how obsession with the past can have grave consequences and destroy relationships is carried over, with a bit more focus on the psychological effects and loss of innocence. TJ is practically a symbol of childhood innocence himself, being the only friend in the group who retains most of it due to his sheltered upbringing. It's no surprise most friends are quick to defend him when serious topics are brought up, and why he adds fuel to the fire of Chase's interest. Chase is practically the opposite. He lost his innocence much earlier in his life after the Sydney incident, and grew up as a cynical, pretty raunchy insomniac in a town he vocally despises. This leads to a serious power imbalance throughout the week, in which the roles from Leo's route completely reverse. For TJ, Chase is just an older friend he looks up to, someone he loves spending time with and seeking advice from, and someone he fails to back away from once his true colors show. As for Chase, this pure-hearted fellow becomes nothing more than a puppet to take advantage of, someone he can share secrets with and manipulate to fill his selfish wants. This toxic dynamic and Chase's depravity illustrate why young adults shouldn't let their fears consume them as they grow up and sins of the past come back to haunt them. While not as thematically complete as Leo's route, there's a solid foundation here for a cautionary tale, especially for people like TJ, but the general execution of this route leaves me a bit torn. There's a similar issue to Leo's route where some parts of the plot feel a little too scattershot and raise unnecessary questions about the setting's logic. For example, how did TJ get one of the main scavenger hunt MacGuffins into a neighbor's closet? Did he break in not knowing that a different person had moved into Sydney's house? Would he have seen the lights on and politely knocked on the door to ask if he could hide a box there? That didn't seem to happen. Nothing in the scene suggests that. I also think that in general, this whole subplot involving a scavenger hunt stretches on for a bit too long, and if you haven't already pieced together the reveal it's leading up to, it loses tension and just becomes a bore to read. With all that said, holy cow. Once Chase has a shocking revelation near the end of the hunt, what follows is a roller coaster of shocking events. I've gotta say, I love this part of the story. It cleverly utilizes supernatural elements and personal drama to show how the town feasts upon the fears of its residents and drives them mad with anger. The use of mirrors to frame all the ghostly encounters was an excellent touch. It not only symbolizes the monster that Chase morphs into, but it blurs the line between hallucinations and reality in ways that remind me of a Satoshi Kon film. It's open to interpretation whether this mirror voice was a separate ghost different from the one that's already in his head, or if Chase is just hallucinating and this represents his mind's dissociation. But that's part of what makes this experience so effective. It's also a direct parallel to Leo's fall from grace, even down to the obsession with a childhood friend and a reflection motif. But the role reversal gives this story a much more personal edge. And oh man, that ending needs no explanation. Chase had to suppress the murder of Sydney throughout his entire adolescence, and it screwed up his head, screwed up everyone in the group who was there to witness, and it especially screwed up Flynn. So the fact that this route ends with Sydney's killer murdering the friend who was most personally affected by Sid's death, fueling the town's never-ending cycle of violence and chaos, just for the sole price of keeping one past atrocity a secret? That's fucked up. Ironically, the biggest issue with this route is TJ himself. For someone who's supposed to be Chase's target of fixation and the only friend who shares his dark secret, he's honestly kinda bland. That's not to say he doesn't have traits, hobbies, childhood memories and such, but the few he has don't go far beyond this naive, goody-two-shoes Christian archetype. There's a scene in Flynn's route where he claims to value living in the present over making new discoveries, which might explain why he wants to hang out with Chase, but that's only a short-term goal that most of his other friends have too. So whatever, TJ, you're not special. I don't mind stagnant characters if they have clear wants and influence the people around them in meaningful ways, but almost everything TJ does is either insisted by someone else, or just kind of tagging along, because plot says so. He doesn't have any deeper goals, dreams, or motivations that give him any real agency, and make him someone you want to feel bad for as he fails his coming-of-age story. You could honestly replace him with a lamp, or a plank of wood, or a body pillow, and the stories of every route would largely be the same. The only time he has a bit of agency is when he sets up this needlessly complicated scavenger hunt to expose the truth of Sydney. It feels very hollow though, because TJ's basic motivations beyond this one short-term goal aren't made clear. I get that he wouldn't want to say the truth outright in front of Flynn or Chase, but why was this the way he chose to do it? Was it his way of processing his trauma? Did he naturally repress it over time? Or does he remember it vividly, but he struggles to describe it under high stress? Is he a snake who thinks nothing of Sydney and just wants to be done with this topic? Does he feel angry about hiding it? Sad about hiding it? It's never made clear because TJ has no backbone or much of a character to begin with outside of his archetypical traits. To give the benefit of the doubt though, TJ's lack of agency doesn't entirely kill the route. It is addressed as a major character flaw, a long-term consequence of his upbringing and the trauma he endured. He was encouraged by his friend to not let others take advantage of his gullibility, but in the end he failed to do just that. He gives into the manipulation of that same friend, leading him down a dark path. This ending is still shocking thanks to Chase's side of the story, but it doesn't really feel like the tragic end of a character who failed to overcome his own social challenges. The best response I got when I thought of TJ was, well, damn. Sucks to be you, I guess.
Let's say...
Loser! You're a loser!
And I hate to sound like a broken record, but the lack of an alternate ending here makes TJ's route feel so unfinished. I don't entirely blame Howley, but nothing stopped him or McSkinney from just going back later on and adding in just a few more dialogue options, maybe just one scene where TJ's own feelings about repressing the truth come to light. It could give TJ the agency he needs to feel like a real character, and be the main thesis of the route. That was all this route needed. Despite my complaints though, I still think that this route mostly holds up, and it's very rewarding to read if you paid attention to other routes. There's enough to appreciate here as a standalone psychological / supernatural horror story, but I can't deny my frustration with the way TJ's side of it was handled. Oh boy. Flynn's route is easily the most perplexing chapter of the novel. Each route has its own twists and turns for sure, but their stories were generally straightforward. This one breaks the mold with sudden shifts in POV, far more sexual content, and a dose of surrealism inspired by Twin Peaks. Flynn himself is especially a mouthful, being the only friend to directly confront the topic of Sydney's death. He's the opposite of Leo in terms of his attitude and how he sees the town, but he's similarly trapped in the past, letting his love for an old friend cloud his better judgment. It's why he has that meltdown at Lake Emma, why he seems more cold and distant from the rest of the group, and why he reels in Chase throughout the week. This route takes its time to peel back the layers of his stubborn personality as Chase spends time with him, and their dynamic is strange to say the least. One day they're throwing curse words at each other, the next they're stripping and making out against the truck, and that's in just the first few minutes. It's a very messy route overall, and it's certainly not for everyone, but a lot of its more out there elements have very clear intentions and come together to make this story, in my opinion, the novel's most thematically dense. It's a twisted and stomach-churning tragedy about how collective trauma does bring people together, but not always for the better. Everyone in the group completely dismisses Flynn, shutting him down anytime he brings up Sid's death and isolating him from the group. It's understandable that most don't want to relive traumatic experiences, but if I had to be on Flynn's side, there does come a point in time where deeper reflection is necessary. The fact that these guys are still avoiding the subject and treating TJ like a child infuriates the Gilla. Sadly though, because Flynn lacked proper consulting growing up, he doesn't make the situation better. It's hard for him to speak his mind without a terrible attitude, and he disregards the severity of how Sydney affected the others, since to him, they just didn't know Sid the way he did. No other route in Echo puts as much spotlight on the messiness of this group. So much feels taken out of hand, yet it's difficult to root for anyone. And while it's frustrating to read, that's the entire point. It's a mature follow-up to the past two routes that further illustrates the need to accept some harsh realities and change for the better. And if that isn't hard to stomach enough already, Flynn's route reflects another form of trauma that's permeated many in and out of Echo: suppressing one's identity. Growing up in the 2000s, he only had 2 gay friends that often ignored him once they started going out. He claims that his aunt wants to send him to a Mormon cult. For a gay man that was ridiculed for his sexuality and had to mostly stay in the closet until adulthood, private one-night stands and getting laid became his most effective coping mechanism. They may not help him accept his whole identity, or treat other issues like his behavior or inability to let go of the past, but to him, they're better than nothing. Flynn's route is the most overtly sexual in the novel because these scenes of adult content gradually unveil a much deeper issue. To Flynn, being a homosexual is repulsive and fills him with utter dread and shame. Sexual deviancy is the only way he accepts this part of his identity, since it brings him short-term relief in ways his body says yes to, without having to face the stress of being open in public. It's why he indulges so much in shady circles, partially why he was disgusted by Chase's relationship with Leo, and why eventually banging Leo himself gave him no sense of joy or pride. That's not to say Flynn doesn't have connections with those he's slept with, but a self-indulgence and how that fuels his bitter attitude causes those relationships to crumble. There's no better example of this than when Flynn invites Chase to the very shady orgies he partakes in. He's indulged so much in this deviancy that he couldn't think to see the ethical boundaries his partner has. hence why it has such a strong reaction when the otter gets disturbed and opts out, regardless of what the player chooses. I enjoyed this route a lot. The drama and horror is the most consistently solid the novel's ever been, with hardly a dull moment I can think of. Even in its few moments of levity, there's this subtle eeriness that helps smoothly transition them to biting angst or sinister encounters. The arguments between the friends are compelling, the recurring mass hysteria is the best it's ever been told in the novel, and while a few scenes are a little derivative of past routes, they're a lot better executed with far less annoying contrivances and just flowing a lot more naturally. Flynn easily could have made this experience unbearable with his obnoxious sailor mouth and cold demeanor, but the novel does a good job at keeping this aura of mystery present all throughout. I was also pleasantly surprised by the scenes involving sex. Sure, they do feel a little out of pocket at first, but they serve their purpose well, and I like how they gradually get more sinister and shady, reflecting Flynn's lack of boundaries and his failure to see the bigger issue. They also make for such excellent build up to this moment where Chase connects the dots and calls out Flynn. It's all just shameless deviancy to mask self-resentment about who he is as a person. It is gut-wrenching and represents a very serious problem that I know speaks to a lot of queer adults. It's also partially fascinating to read because Echo was written as far back as 2015, when gay marriage had only just become legal in the US and the general culture was very different. McSkinny was very open about being a gay man who grew up in the middle of nowhere, so there's a lot of personal experience woven into this story that gives it the emotional backbone it needed. Since fear of change and acceptance are already very common themes in this novel, Flynn's route thematically enriches it like no other.
I'm not a furry. Like, that's the thing. And I think that's what people are most surprised about. I was for a very brief time when I was like 14 or 15, just for like sort of a phase thing. It was mainly because I was connecting with, there was a bunch of other LGBT people, and that's not something I really encountered much. But no, I'm just a gay dude who lives out in the middle of nowhere in Arizona, and that's sort of what makes Echo so appealing, is a lot of the stuff I'm kind of writing from slightly first-hand experience. And I know that's what Hallie is also doing as well. A lot of the character of Chase is essentially sort of a representation of him in sort of some regard.
And I must say, even after covering the general story, it still has many tricks up its sleeve that elevate the experience in ways no other route does. Take these flashbacks, for instance. In other routes, they offer glimpses of the past with this jarring art style shift, which, fun fact, was actually designed and drawn by a fan for an AMV during the novel's development. They serve their purpose by adding some minor tension, but I'd be lying if I said they didn't come off as filler in many places. In Flynn's route, though, they creatively drive the plot forward, abruptly cutting in and out of the present with POV shifts from none other than Flynn's target himself, Sidney Bronson. This greatly adds to the story's feeling of uncertainty as the week goes by, especially since they gradually delve into the deeper, darker aspects of his childhood, like the familial abuse he endured and the horrifying death of his father. They offer answers as to why Flynn was so attached to him and why other friends just don't remember him as kindly, while raising even more questions. What's going on? Why is the POV suddenly from this kid? Is Chase thinking about this? Is Flynn thinking about this? It's as if the otter who drowned that fateful day is coming back to haunt the man who killed him. If I had to nitpick though, there's a few times this route can feel a little padded as it inches closer to Saturday evening. The job interview scene from Carl's route is directly copied over, with the only substantial difference being Flynn's involvement. It does feel in character and explain why Carl tags along, but I won't deny it feels a little odd in this route. There's also this one branching scene that either means completely nothing if the reader chose Flynn's roommate, or severely undermines the impact of a different route if the reader chose Leo. I'm honestly not a fan of the idea that Leo can just get over his year's worth of unhealthy fixation in just a week after an earlier meltdown. And speaking of nitpicks, if you're someone who's read the novel already, you might be asking how I feel about the last 10 minutes of Flynn's route. I won't deny, they are the most surreal this novel gets. The Twin Peaks inspiration comes at full front here, and while my general thoughts are a bit mixed, this ending does fit the route more nicely than you'd think. Since drowning Sidney, Chase had been possessed by the ghost of a resident named Samuel Ayers, who would later latch onto Flynn after the otter nearly tied to one of his traps. This continues a pattern of possession that other routes unveil, starting with Mr. Bronson after killing him with his van, then Sidney, who witnessed his father's death, then Chase at Lake Emma, and finally in this route, Flynn. Earlier that week on Thursday, Sam confronted the ghost of a very angry Sidney, who wandered the town for God knows how long at this point. This explains why the flashbacks of Sidney's life came to fruition, and why he'd eventually confront Flynn himself as the town's embrace peaks. The way I interpret it, this ending is a brief moment in time where the fallen otter is desperate to reconnect with his old best friend, especially now that he's not under Sam's influence. He even props up this reality where he got to live and grow up beside him, a mere illusion of what Flynn wanted. Because Flynn refuses to accept this though, having already learned some of the truth from Chase, Sam takes control of Sid once again. A lot of what he says in this scene is very cryptic, but the key takeaways are that Sam heavily looks down upon Flynn for his attitude, and pities him for how much his friends denied the justice he wanted. This ghost has become so numb to the town's suffering throughout generations, and wants nothing but to see his old friends again. It's understandable why he'd call this lizard a sin to all who initially cared for him, while prompting an ominous solution for him to seek that justice. This leads Flynn to become anchored to the town as one of its many cryptids, hopping across points in time and allowing him to revisit that fateful day at the cost of his life. Hallie and McSkinny have said very little about this ending, so what this monster represents, why it's able to hop across time and such, are intentionally vague. Taking everything into account though, I believe the socket face is an extension of the town's embrace that reflects its never-ending cycle of suffering. The times it appears are only when the town's residents are at their lowest point, which include the lynching of Jana's ancestor, the suicide of Mr. Bronson, the torturing of Brian's victims, and the nights where a scared child seeks help. In other words, this monster personifies this looming sense of despair and unacceptance that many face in a world that's out to get them, especially in isolated environments like the conservative ghost town of Echo. It may not violently attack those it stalks, with a few exceptions like Brian and Leo and Jenna's routes, but it's present nonetheless. No matter the point in time, for as long as mankind continues to damn itself with its own hate, its own prejudice, it never fades away. It may not lash out or attack those it stalks, but it's always there, looming in the dark corners of the room behind you, for as long as you live. This personification recontextualizes all the frustration and paranoia that Flynn, Leo, Carl, Chase, and others reflected to some degree throughout the novel. Symbolically, narratively, and quite literally, there was no better person in the novel to represent this self-loathing and existential dread than Flynn himself. As tragic as the circumstances that led him here are, it's understandable why he'd accept this fate without fully knowing the cost. He had many chances to let go of the past and appreciate what life brought him to the table, even if it wouldn't be easy. He'd still have to overcome personal difficulties with his trauma, his own identity, and especially his friends who all have their issues too. But it could have been better than holding on to this lack of closure as a grudge for most of his life. Like the town itself, he just kept going in circles, filling his life with shallow, sometimes unethical substitutes for recovery, indulging in his own bitterness and selfishness. By this point, it's too late for him to turn things around. He does get the justice he wanted, with Chase having cut ties with all his friends, losing his job after failing to follow up the Echo report, and essentially wandering the town alone more miserable than ever. But considering what Flynn sacrificed to get there, was it really worth it? This ending is a fantastic scene on its own merit, and beautifully poetic in its tragedy. And while my interpretation could be wrong, the murkiness of this route's ending makes it stick with you. It's a near perfect ending for a very solid route overall. Except for one elephant in the room. This shit was clearly made up later in development. Originally, Flynn's character was supposed to be a meta-narrative antagonist akin to Monica from Doki Doki, while the Socket Face was a different entity entirely. After McSkinny joined midway through development though, this was retcon and Flynn became the monster, since games like Doki Doki had quickly lost their luster by that point. As much as I think it was a smart creative decision on paper, in practice it just feels so tacked on when you try to turn your brain cells on. Almost every scene with Flynn before the halfway point of his route feel way too in line with the original vision, and it takes away so much immersion whenever you reread the novel. It's frustrating to grasp and just makes the whole entire story feel sloppy. I don't think there needs to be an explanation for everything in Echo and how its cryptids manifest, for the same reason I don't need to know about the Xenomorph mythos or the logic behind Mima's dissociation. However, this whole time-hopping, dimension-hopping, out-there take on the Socket Face that makes every route canon in Hallie's word really stretches the logic of this story. It feels like a mix of clashing ideas that's somewhat but not quite meta-narrative, somewhat but not quite self-contained, and it fails to be both as a result. It sucks this route had to end on such a mess of an ending, because it's otherwise the strongest of the novel. Sure, many elements are an acquired taste, and Flynn himself can make it hard to stomach for some, but I think the payoff is more than satisfying, with a great balance of horror and melancholy, and bold statements that feel very raw, personal, and recontextualize many parts of the novel nicely. Just don't think too hard about that ending. Jenna. The final route complete in development belongs to the one, the only, Jenna Begay. No, I'm not cracking a joke about her name. Someone already did that for me. I'm just going to be honest, coming in from the highs of the other routes, this one was very disappointing. That doesn't mean I inherently think it's bad, but it takes what's otherwise solid groundwork and somehow twists it up with strange and sometimes frustrating execution. Before I tear it apart though, I'll analyze what it's trying to say and what works well about it. Jenna stands out from the group by being the only friend who seems the most in control of her life. As if the Sydney incident wasn't enough, she got the short end of the fucking stick growing up. She lived in an abusive household, lost her older brother, had terrible grade school experiences, and eventually ran away with Chase's help. In the present though, she seems to be doing pretty well compared to everyone else. She's acing her classes, maintaining good habits, and enjoying the reunion while she can. She's a type A go-getter who refuses to let the past hold her back. But much like everyone else, she's still shaken up by trauma in ways that she fails to recognize. When you read between the lines of her playful snark and her sassy antics, she's honestly a petty, spiteful, and judgmental hypocrite. She constantly belittles her friends, ignores signs of their own baggage for as long as she can make a clever quip, refuses to apologize for bad things she did in the past, and is prone to let envy cloud her better judgment. Even in the first route, she gives Carl the cold shoulder for failing to keep up in school and mooching off his family's wealth. This is Carl! Freaking Carl! The worst he ever did was bang Flynn and get spoiled by a loving family in a nice house throughout his life without having to work for any luxury. Basically have everything Jenna didn't. Her jealousy is understandable, but you'd think that a so-called psychology student would at least consider the emotional baggage her friends are going through before treating them like lesser beings. And that's where Jenna's biggest issue lies. Despite how far she's run away from Echo, she's still haunted by it. Her traumatic upbringing and connections with the group led her to develop a toxic superiority complex. Jenna has the right setup for a unique perspective on how relationships and growing up can be stifled by neglecting serious baggage. And to the novel's credit, there are engaging plot threads in her route that fit this setup perfectly. Carl's disappearance leads Jenna and Chase to confront certain people who remind them of the town's worst qualities. Heather was someone who screwed her over in the past and is somewhat antithetical to her as a whole, being another abuse victim who lashes out on others when she's at a breaking point, almost wanting to destroy the whole town to put an end to her suffering. Jeremy is her brother, a reminder of the abuse she endured and the guilt she felt when she ran away. And Mika, well, he's just kind of there to tag along, Patreon characters be damned. But at least he comes around to suggest redemption. If Chase calls out her hypocrisy and tells her that despite everything, they still had each other growing up and kept each other sane, this leads to a resolution where Jenna decides she won't take her frustrations out on the town or her friends anymore, even when she has the chance to do so. Quite literally. This whole route suggests the best way to move on from the past is to reconcile, acknowledge the bad that happened, carefully revisit the crime scene if you can, and learn to forgive those who've done you wrong. That doesn't mean excusing them for the pain they've caused, but it's a step in the right direction to properly letting go, and appreciating those who stick by your side. I'll admit, it is a little jarring to see the cast go from one story about why some friend groups suck and can't stay together, to one where they do stick together by the end, but on paper, I don't think it's a bad message for this novel. Other routes in the past like Carl's suggest that some friends can stay together if they learn to overcome their baggage and understand each other more. Even Leo's route suggested a faint possibility that he might meet Chase again, as long as they're both on better terms. It's overall a strong message that thematically ties everything in the novel nicely, and there are some qualities this route has going for it. There's no issue like Leo or TJ's route here where the plot feels sloppy or drags at points. Things constantly happen and flow very naturally. I like the scene where Chase observes Heather's house and the atmosphere builds up before you see her insanity at full display. The scene where you dig up the grave and read the full name of Samuel Ayers makes for a great oh shit moment, for better or worse if you've read The Smoke Room. And do I need to mention this terrifying scene where a half-conscious Leo leads to the arrival of a familiar face? No joke, it may look goofy out of context, but when I first read this story, this scared the shit out of me and I nearly fell off my loft bed. There's a generally bittersweet tone to many parts that almost feel like the writers themselves are reflecting on Echo as a project, just as much as Chase and Jenna reflect on their own upbringing. The scenes where these two alone are together are some of my favorites since they have an interesting dynamic, and Jenna gets to naturally open up in ways that say a lot with a little. I especially love this conversation where they're looking for Duke and reflect upon their prank, talk about how her grandma built a strong network through her sheer kindness, and just talk about their life. It's a beautiful calm before the storm that not only prompts Jenna to reconsider her actions, but it makes this change in her ways feel more meaningful since it requires player agency. It's because of Chase being at her side that she's able to take steps forward into becoming a better person. Somewhat Wow, it sounds like Jenna's route has a lot going for it. Good setup, good plot beats, a complex character, and a nice theme that's emblematic of the novel. What could possibly make it so disappointing? Well, buckle up because I do not have any more nice things to say about this route. First of all, why is this retreading Leo's route? For some reason, many plot points feel like they shift more attention to Leo than Jenna and her own personal trauma. Yes, Leo is important to the novel, and he does some bad things that make sense to be brought to attention in this route, but he eats up way too much screen time. Certain plot points like the Brian torture scene just feel like inferior takes on scenes from his route, and some scenes with him are just groan-inducing. I can't stand this scene at the mall. Leo's lust for the Chussie is so exaggerated in such a short amount of time that it feels like I'm reading an abridged parody. Sure, Leo would get intimate with Chase and tease him on and off, but at least he mostly kept it in his pants until Chase opened up enough. In what world would this same wolf publicly dry hump him against a claw machine in a kiddie arcade on Tuesday? In general, it just feels like Leo's watered down to this complete lamp that gets into fights, becomes half unconscious for most of the weekend, and gets called out as a meathead by Jenna just so she looks better by default and to remind readers that yes, this is her route. That is just lazy. Feels like the writers had a lot of leftover ideas for how they wanted to write Leo, especially since the prequel Route 65 had some loose threads going on, but instead of revising Leo's route, they just try to awkwardly connect them to Jenna's story. And I'm not a fan of the results. And speaking of Jenna, when she's not sharing a quiet moment with Chase, I feel like many scenes with her radiate this obnoxious Hollywood girl boss energy, and it does not gel well with the tone of the novel. I understand that Jenna's superiority complex is a major trait that's largely shaped by her trauma, and it's not out of character for her to make clever quips or comebacks or try to prove all the men around her wrong. On paper, I don't have issue with that, but did she need to feel so arbitrarily put on a pedestal by the game's world? The awful scene with Leo and the claw machine? Girl boss! Jenna tells the idiot man-child to fuck off and he gets so comedically mad. But it's all good, she won the prize he was working for in just her first try. You go, queen! The moment her brother enters Brian's lair and sees his own sister pinned up to the wall by a serial killer, girl boss! She tells him to get lost and he just dips out of the entire story. Forget all those parallels to the group and the fact that he's the only relative she felt somewhat guilty for leaving behind. That tense and scary moment where they need to barge into Heather's house as she's going off the deep end, girl boss! Jenna talks her way out with the power of friendship like it's fucking Persona. Or if the reader chose the bad ending, she somehow goes apeshit and tells Flynn to score a headshot. As if that isn't on the nose enough, she goes further off the deep end and floods the entire town. If you count the bad ending of this route, this chick has a higher body count than the actual serial killer.
I need to kill. I need to kill.
For a novel that mostly succeeds in having a mature tone, these scenes just feel so adolescent, and they do not make Jenna come off as a person that I want to see get better by the end. Speaking of which, this fucking dam. Not only was it never mentioned in other routes and has no meaningful ties to the town's history, but it's such a ham-fisted metaphor that leads to a rather silly resolution. I get why the story needed Heather to try and murder something since it's emblematic of the suffering that Jenna and her friends went through, but why the whole town? Why not just Jeremy? He's Jenna's brother, he's a reminder of her abuse and its lingering effects that led her to develop this superiority complex. And when Heather's at her lowest point and wants all the suffering to end, she wants her friends gone too. Heather could have been the perfect antithesis had the scope of her destruction been narrowed down to someone both she and Jenna shared a connection with. It would have allowed Jenna to shine in a way that showed her true strength in overcoming trauma, and tying up all those earlier threads. Even without Jeremy though, was the scene where they rescue Carl and Jenna tells Heather to put the gun down not enough to show that she changed? I guess not. All these issues with the story are frustrating and make it hard to take seriously, but I think the biggest issue of all has to be the fact that Jenna herself and her development feel largely taken for granted. I'd say it's a bigger issue here than in TJ's though, because while TJ was underwritten and more of a device, he wasn't unlikable either, and the story still brought attention to his faults. His characterization, as flawed as it may be, still felt thematically in line with his story. Jenna, however, is underwritten and unlikable, yet the entire story hinges on the reader rooting for her by the end, in a big climax that does not feel earned. I would have at least tolerated those Leo retreads and some of the sillier elements of the story if there was at least still a clear-cut focus on Jenna and the consequences of her upbringing and her actions. However, there's just not much outside of those scenes with Chase, and occasionally those other three. If anything, Jenna's been largely reduced to a bystander that does jack squat as she watches the madness unfold around her, at least until the final confrontation. Perhaps this was so Jenna could observe and learn to see the best in those who matter to her, as terrible things do happen to the friends she once belittled. If that was the writer's intention though, I don't think this works as well as it should since the story doesn't focus on her friends enough. Flynn and TJ get very heavily sidelined, which is odd because those two were arguably the most affected by Jenna's presence. Flynn was someone she'd constantly beat down and pressure to bottle up, and TJ was someone she coddled like a little brother, which didn't cause, but certainly fueled his lack of agency. The subplot with Carl's disappearance is still engaging for what it is, but there was a lot of missed opportunity to show how dysfunctional the group is, without the glue that holds them together. If this route wanted to divert attention away from Jenna herself, there could have been more events or interpersonal arguments among the friend group that either call her out or get her to recognize how her ego led her to prioritize one-upping her friends, rather than appreciating them for what they did to help her grow up. That's why this route is so disappointing to me. The setup is great, the blueprints are there, some scenes are fantastic, but outside of that one small talk with Chase, nothing meaningful comes from them. At best, it feels like this route is just hitting bullet points and rushing to the finish line. As a result, this epiphany she has by the end when she tells Heather not to flood the town feels very half-baked and lacks the punch it needed to be satisfying. And I'm sorry if I sound petty, but I do not buy that Jenna learned to move on when she only got a slap in the wrist for all the nasty things she did to her friends. And those apologies she gave Leo and Chase in the end are so insincere, she might as well have just pulled out an ukulele. Also, should I talk about the van scene? Was there really a need for this scene where the friends find out that Leo basically groomed a 13-year-old and filmed CP when he was 17? Was it so important that the van it took place in is the mascot for Route 65, gets referenced in Flynn's route, and becomes a point of drama in Jenna's route? Other routes made it clear already that Leo's relationship with Chase was damaged goods and stemmed from personal insecurity akin to Flynn. They were gay teens in a homophobic time period who had zero guidance on their sexuality outside of porn. So it made sense that they did very vulgar acts and explored themselves in ways no teen ever should. This novel could have left things at that, and the story would have been fine. It did not need to go all the way to say that Leo was so misguided, he filmed a cheese pizza with a middle schooler! This doesn't add anything substantial to the story, especially not in the context of Jenna's route. What if instead of Mika, it was Jeremy he filmed the cheese pizza with? I still would have personally hated it as a creative decision, but it would have at least given Jenna's reaction and the way she calms down to see the best in him more significance. I'm not against stories that have disturbing subject matter like this, but this whole scene just felt like a baffling, misguided creative decision. Roses are blue, violets are red. Every day I wake up and I hope that Leo drops dead. Got a little angry there at the end. I can't say that Jenna's route is worse than Carl's overall. There are some good scenes, and there are things it does better than most routes, but the low points are really low. The way it mishandled its message and Jenna's character when the building blocks were right there, mixed with some very confusing plot beats, make this a very frustrating route to revisit. With all that being said, I am glad I reread it for this retrospective, since seeing all the friends together in this ending for once felt a bit euphoric. It's definitely wish fulfillment that once again shows this novel lost most of its deconstructive focus, but I can't hate it. And that final dialogue choice that calls back to the beginning, cleverly breaking the fourth wall to show how Sam, controlled by none other than the player themselves, influenced Chase the whole time, was genuinely brilliant. I never fail to get goosebumps when I read it. I respect that McSkinney tried to tie off this novel with a bow. I just wish it wasn't so frustrating to revisit.
But I'm not done yet!
Hidden in the game's menus are a collection of 7 short stories that were once exclusive Patreon rewards. They were added to the main game for the novel's anniversary update, and offer brief glimpses of the characters' lives at earlier points. I don't have much to say about them. They're nice inclusions overall, especially for preserving all the work that was put into this mess of a project. But as far as enriching the main story goes, I'd say only 3 hit the bullseye. Trip was a terrifying short read with great audio mixing that highlights Carl's deeper anxiety, especially the fear of his friends keeping secrets from him. It's heartbreaking knowing the full picture, and it shows how even the most innocent characters in Echo can still be haunted by their trauma and the town's embrace. My personal favorite was Lights, which is a mildly tense and bittersweet coming of age involving TJ. It's a nice extension of the novel's general themes, with a great transition from small-scale personal drama to a looming sensation of existential dread, as he feels something lurking behind him. This is obviously one of Echo's many cryptids, but I like to think it's a representation of TJ's own religious guilt, how he begins to doubt his faith as he sees more of the world around him, and how his ideal church life isolates some of his friends. As someone who grew up in a Christian household, but eventually faced doubts I was scared to think about for a long time, this one really stuck with me, and it's a shame this wasn't carried over to TJ's route. The third I recommend is Runaway, which might honestly have the best characterization of Jenna in the whole novel. I don't know many who grew up in abusive households, but I do know that those experiences are very difficult to talk about, and Jenna conveys this very effectively through some gripping dialogue that shows her scars, her determination, and her complex relationship with Chase. The fact that she's the one who brings up the idea for Chase to go to college was also a great touch. It shows that she knows he deserves better than living in Echo too, but as thanks for helping her reach independence, she respects his as well. As for the other bonus stories, they're not bad. They're fine inclusions overall. They might be a decent read if you're a fan of these characters, but they were written as teasers for Patreon backers, and they feel like it. Maybe Chase and Leo's breakup hits differently when you read Phone, since it is told from Leo's point of view, but I'd be lying if I said their omission would hardly change a thing about the novel's experience. And that's the story of Echo. For an indie horror game that's free to download, the amount of content this story has to offer is commendable, but I can't deny it's a rough patch job of clumsy plots and underutilized characters. Revisiting the novel has shown its many cracks and frustrating creative decisions. However, for as much as this game doesn't quite stick the landing as a deconstruction, or as a visual novel in general, reading all the routes again helped me weirdly appreciate it more. Every character has a deeply personal fear and motivation that leads to unpleasant but believable patterns of destructive behavior, which forms such a strong emotional core. It makes what otherwise could have been a mess of clashing horror elements come together very nicely. There's high personal stakes and drama that's equal parts scary, tragic, thrilling, romantic, and bittersweet, all in one bizarre, messy, but unforgettable experience. Every story built off each other well to highlight the importance of growing up, facing change about yourself and the people around you, recognizing and breaking destructive cycles, and learning to move forward at the end of the day, even if that means cutting ties with certain people and making difficult decisions. Do I think this story would have been stronger had all these routes been condensed into one linear book? Well, it certainly would have reduced some issues with the padding, and it likely would have felt more focused. But I don't think this approach would have been as interesting or even life-changing to experience. That bone-chilling quote from Sam at the beginning wasn't just an eerie tone setter, it's an embodiment of everything that happens in the town. Just like Echo itself, people are always going in circles, including the reader themselves as they go through this non-linear anthology, experiencing this inescapable time loop where different horrors and pieces of the puzzle come together. And despite how bleak the stories are, they still have a very optimistic message beneath them all, and a feeling of hope that these cycles can be broken. There is a lot to love about Echo, and you can see all the strokes of a cleverly written, very personal and emotionally effective horror masterpiece. When people claim it's their favorite visual novel, or even one of their all-time favorite games, I get it. I really do. I was one of those people too at one point. This just makes it all the more frustrating that every route falls short of greatness, and that Echo Project as a whole was just a very poorly managed project. As I'm writing this, Echo Project took a huge dent in its reputation after patterns of poor business and poor creative decisions. They didn't set up proper contracts, bit way more than they could chew, started a bunch of projects with new hires before Echo even finished, which unsurprisingly meant a lot of them got very scarce updates. Only one game, a prequel to Echo called The Smoke Room, was receiving regular updates, but it got axed after a string of drama with its lead writer, and general failure on the team's part to hold accountability. With how successful Echo and even its sister novel Ad Astra were, you'd think there'd at least be a solid follow-up to keep the ball rolling, right? Well, The Smoke Room is no longer deemed a prequel now that it's run by a different studio, and while I can't speak on the quality of Arches, it's safe to say most readers have just moved on to other games by that point. The team might be back in action now, but I don't expect Echo Project to last much longer. Howley and McSkitty might have Echo as a permanent part of their legacy, but if there's any story they poured their heart into that made it through to the end, I'm glad it was Echo. I may not be a fan of their other works, or especially the team they're a part of, but if writing is what they're passionate about, I hope they keep at it and continue to hone their craft. They've proven together that you don't need to have the best skill or the most experience to tell a story that, for all its faults, still has a lot going for it and inspires crowds. I think that's part of why this story resonated with me for so long, and why I wanted to share my thoughts about it. I'm not exaggerating when I say that no other game I played made me feel so recognized. I shared a lot of fears and negative traits with the main cast, and it wasn't until this novel that I realized how damaging they were. I was similarly trapped in a sheltered worldview like TJ, I was scared of growing up like Leo, I was jealous of other people like Jenna, and like Carl, Flynn, or Chase, I struggled to accept parts of myself and had a hard time connecting with others as a result. I made terrible mistakes, downplayed some hard times my own loved ones were going through, and I never realized their severity until I almost lost one. It's hard to let go of the fact that I could have done better, but I don't need to let the past anchor me down. I try to see the best in other people, be open-minded about who I spend my time with, and try to break any distractive patterns I notice. Echo is very personal to me because I would not be the same person without it. And as hard as it may be to love, I will always respect it for what it did exceptionally well. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this video. This was my first, as you can tell, this is the only video that I've made so far. I don't plan to take off as a YouTuber or anything. I've just had a lot of thoughts about this silly novel for a very long time and wanted to share them. If any of you guys read Echo and have your own thoughts, whether you loved it or it wasn't your cup of tea, feel free to let me know in the comments. As I said earlier in the video, Echo is a novel that I think is worth discussing. If Echo wasn't your cup of tea, that's perfectly fine. But I hope this video at least got you to consider why this novel struck a chord with so many people and why it has a vocal fan base even to this day.